The video footage had played for the 11th time that morning, and the Supreme Commander, Dret, watched it again. He saw 3 human ships, scouts, tiny things. The Empire used similar vessels for delivering messages between stations or transporting low-level bureaucrats to insignificant meetings. There was nothing in them that should have inspired fear. The Eternal Dominion was a Tyron-class warship, 2.4 kilometers long, boasting 48 plasma batteries and featuring shield systems that cost more to build than most colonies. It carried 400 crew members and, in 30 years, had survived 9 skirmishes without a single significant loss. The 3 human ships approached as if they knew the answer to a question no one had even thought to ask. The first ship shifted left at an angle that the Dominion's automated threat detection system classified as non-threatening, because physics dictated that no ship could safely turn at such an angle. The system was right about physics. It was wrong about whether the human ship cared. It turned, remained intact, and brought the Dominion's broadside batteries into full tracking range. At that same instant, the second ship broadcasted on 14 frequencies. It wasn't a signal or communication. It was pure noise, structured in a harmonic pattern that would take Imperial analysts 3 weeks of heated debate to decode. The Dominion's targeting system began to filter it, because filtering noise is what targeting systems do. It took 11 seconds. In those 11 seconds, the third human ship crossed the minimum firing distance. Passing through the triangular shadow created by the retraction of the broadside guns and the second ship's interference, it shoved something into the exhaust port. The gap in the exhaust port was the diameter of a drainage pipe, an artifact of a compromise in the Tyron-class cooling system. It had been in the engineering documents for 30 years, marked as a known limitation. Every engineer who had studied the Dominion's schematics knew it existed. The humans had never seen those schematics. They had watched a Tyron-class ship during normal operation and found the gap themselves, using thermal imaging and long-term observation. The Eternal Dominion vanished in 6 seconds. The 3 human ships departed at high speed. The outgoing transmission analysis team noted that one of the ships seemed to be broadcasting a music file during its retreat. It was placed on the last page of their report without comment. They hoped no one would ask for an explanation. Dret stopped the recording. His aide, Sorrel, stood by the door, frozen in that particular state of fear he hoped Dret wouldn't notice. "How long has the Empire been observing human space?" Dret asked. 63 years, Commander. Classification: Class 3, Primitive. Dret stared at the dark screen. Convene the Council. The High Council of the Galactic Empire gathered in the spire of Rita on the capital world of Vaughn, in a circular chamber built when the Empire was half its current size and far more prone to decisive action. There were 47 seats representing 11 species. The hall was circular, a statement of equality, according to the architects. Dret's seat sat on a platform 3 centimeters higher than the others. It was also an architect's decision. No one ever discussed the discrepancy. It had existed for 400 years. The video was played for the council. The silence that followed was peculiar, the silence of people coming to the same thought simultaneously, calculating whether it was safer to say it first or wait for someone else to break the seal. Councillor Emrat of the Murans spoke first. The Murans were large, amphibious, and confident in a way that was usually inversely proportional to their actual readiness. 3 scout ships, Emrat said. 1 skirmish. Is this why we summoned the full council? We summoned the full council, Dret said cautiously, because our tactical department has spent 3 weeks studying this encounter and cannot provide an explanation. The room shifted a soft rustle of 47 chairs. It was the way a crowd changes when it stops being a crowd and becomes a collection of individuals, each conducting their own private, fearful tally. Next was Councillor Tez of the Vesks. The Vesks were methodical, long-fingered, and had the habit of examining every explanation before settling on the worst one: the gap in the exhaust. It is documented in our closed engineering files. If the humans accessed it, they accessed our files. Dret's voice didn't rise. Security review complete. There were no breaches. No data was lost. The gap exists on every ship of that class due to the geometry of the cooling system. The humans observed a Tyron-class ship during normal operation and deduced the gap themselves. Tez was very quiet. They found a flaw in our best warship simply by watching it move, Dret said. Old Councillor Burr, the eldest Dolari on the council, whose scales had turned the pale color of old snow and who had personally witnessed 6 interstellar wars, remained silent for a long time. No species reaches this level of tactical precision in 40 years. Something in the chronology is wrong. Or, Drett said, something in our understanding of what they were doing for those 40 years is wrong. That was the sentence that started the real argument. It lasted 4 hours. Drett listened to most of it. In his experience, the content of an argument was less useful than its form. What the room argued about most fiercely revealed what it feared most. Over 4 hours, the council displayed 2 distinct fears. The first was a comforting fear. Perhaps the Empire had misclassified human capabilities, and there were hidden programs and decades of quiet weapons research that their observers had simply missed. This fear naturally led to increased surveillance and budget discussions. It placed the problem in a box the Empire knew how to manage. The second fear appeared twice, fleetingly in quieter voices. Both times the conversation quickly moved past it, but Drett heard it. The second fear was that there were no hidden programs, that the 3 ships were not the product of an arms factory, but the result of a way of thinking, a perspective humanity had developed. And that was the true threat. It wasn't what they had built, but what had built it. The Empire knew how to find weapons. It did not know how to find a way of thinking. The vote was not close. Immediate military action failed. Intelligence gathering passed. One operation, silent human space. Find what the Empire had missed. Drett already knew whom to send before the vote ended. VTech had been recruited into Imperial intelligence at 22, which, by Carrion standards, meant they were halfway through their first growth stage and still occasionally surprised by their own limbs. 22 years later, VTech was surprised by very little. Carrions were tall, angular in the bone, with gray skin and a posture others described as elegant when convenient, or threatening when it made VTech professionally useful. VTech was shorter than average, softer featured, and had spent 2 decades learning to stand in a room in a way that made people forget they were there. The human file was thick. VTech read it in a small office above the station's docking ring, sipping what the cafeteria called tea and looking out at the freighters moving in the dark. Files like this had a familiar shape, a primitive world, internal conflicts, a slow process of consolidation, usually driven by a dominant force or a shared external threat. Contact with the Empire usually came as either a trade opportunity or a military target. Most species arrived at contact already shaped by this process, already in some sense tamed. In humanity's file, this shape held for 40 pages. Then, the shape changed. 80 years ago, observers wrote with suppressed zeal about a species that possessed enough weapons technology to destroy itself, but not enough collective wisdom to be sure it wouldn't. The analytical forecasts of that period were accurate and consistent. Humanity would stabilize within 40 years or not at all. Most forecasts assumed the latter. 43 years ago, major wars ceased. Not immediately, not perfectly. The reports of that period were full of minor conflicts and regional tensions, documented with the weary tone of people cataloging predictable weather. But the weapons aimed at each other, those big enough to definitively end Imperial forecasts, were pulled back, and hundreds of competing governments that had tormented each other for centuries slowly, piece by piece, began to move in one direction. VTech noted that page and went back to read it again, because 43 years ago almost exactly coincided with when the Empire's trade fleet expanded its routes at the edge of what was now classified as the human sensor range. Not close enough for official contact, not close enough to be anything more than distant signals in the dark, but close enough to be detected. VTech sat for a long time with that thought. Humans, with 195 governments, hadn't unified through internal political evolution. Internal political evolution doesn't move that fast. Nothing moves that fast without a specific, visible reason. Humanity had seen something in the dark, and then humanity had stopped warring with itself. VTech turned to page 71. There was a 3-paragraph note from a field observer named Biff, who had spent 3 years above human space and, apparently, was either very bored or very thorough. The note was marked as low priority and had never been studied by anyone with decision-making power. Human academic institutions have demonstrated a sustained, coordinated interest in xenobiology, xenolinguistics, and alien engineering principles over the past decade. This interest appears consistent across research centers in multiple countries. Despite the lack of an explicit centralized coordinating body, the volume of published work has grown by 340% in 10 years. Recommend expanded analysis. Priority: low. Low priority. Who had read this note, assigned it a low rating, and moved on. VTech wondered what 40 years of coordinated, quietly growing academic interest in alien biology and engineering would produce in a species that had 195 governments moving together. A species that had seen something in the dark and decided at a level that was obviously collective and obviously fast that it needed to understand this thing before this thing understood it. The standard mission objective said, "Find the weapons programs." Page 71 suggested the standard objective was the wrong question. VTech took the cosmetic kit. The shuttle crossed human space on the 6th day. By the 3rd day of the transition, VTech had found a section of the file that the intelligence department had buried in the appendix, a collection of intercepted human messages spanning 15 years, covering topics analysts considered non-threatening. Most of it was noise, personal messages, news content, entertainment. But scattered throughout 15 years and dozens of human languages was a pattern. Humans were asking each other questions about the galaxy. How many species were there? What did their ships look like? How did they fight? What did they value? What did they fear? It wasn't in any organized forum marked as suspicious. It was just people showing curiosity about the Empire for 15 years. The shuttle moved through the dark, and VTech sat with the file, sleeping little. In a building in a city on Earth, in a room that did not appear on any public map, a woman named Director Sauron looked at a screen showing an Imperial ship crossing the human sensor range. She was not surprised. She had expected something like this. 4 years had passed since the Dominion incident, since the small team she had sanctioned did what they were told and returned. She turned to the man on her left. "Sector C, single ship profile." The man turned to his screen. She looked out the window at a city going about its business in the daylight. "Profile matches," the man said. "Intelligence operative. Carrion class." She nodded. "Set protocol air to standby." She thought about it for 3 seconds. "Not yet," she said. "Let them watch. Let them see what we want them to see." She paused. "And make sure Dr. Voss knows she might have a visitor at the university." "Which protocol?" Director Sauron walked to the door. "Tell her to use her judgment." She left. Outside the window, the city moved through its day, as cities do. The noise, the traffic, the people walking, the light falling on the building in the ordinary way of a world that, by all outward appearances, was completely unprepared for what was coming. It wasn't unprepared. It had just decided some time ago not to look like it. The city was called Portland. It was not a military city. VTech established this within the first 2 hours of walking through it, which took longer than it should have, because VTech kept expecting to find things that weren't there. Hidden checkpoints, the quiet tension that settles on a population that knows it is being watched, the specific, low-frequency terror of a people preparing for a war they feel could start at any moment. In Portland, on Wednesday mornings, there was a farmer's market. VTech stood on the edge, watching people buy vegetables from other people, while children ate things wrapped in paper on wooden benches, and a man argued with a parking inspector about where exactly the permitted zone ended. The argument was held in a moderate tone, with some sharp gestures toward a small, painted line on the ground, and it ended with the man paying on his handheld device and walking away, continuing to speak to no one in particular in a tone that suggested he had many more thoughts on the matter but no longer had an audience to share them with. That is not what a species at war looks like. VTech kept walking. The carrion makeup held up better than expected in the daylight. The bone structure was wrong at close range, but humans had a remarkable ability to see what they expected to see, and they expected to see another human. VTech walked at an average speed and maintained eye contact in the appropriate amount, which according to the preparatory materials was more than a Vesk and less than a Murin. The council was accurate. The public library was 3 blocks from the market. VTech entered because libraries were useful. They revealed what a population deemed worthy of preserving. It was a balance between practical knowledge and philosophy, between history and entertainment, between things a culture keeps because they are useful and things it keeps because they have meaning. This balance told something real about where a civilization's focus was directed. On the main floor were fiction and history, and a children's corner. By the windows was a reading room with elderly people in soft chairs. VTech went down to the basement, to the academic collection, 3 full aisles on xenolinguistics. Not theoretical xenolinguistics, not the philosophical kind that asks if interspecies communication is possible in principle, but practical. Aisle 1. Analysis of the carrion clicking language. 2 separate volumes, both with fresh creases on the spine. Aisle 2. a 6-volume comparative study of Murin dialect structures, a textbook titled Applied Key, a framework for interspecies negotiations. Its cover was worn at the corners the way things get worn when they are used. They kept it. 2 more aisles on xenobiology. 1 long shelf on the comparative history of alien wars, covering the 6 most significant internal conflicts of the Empire based on publicly available Imperial records and cross-referenced with intercepted transmission data and an analysis that VTech didn't recognize and couldn't immediately identify the source of. VTech stood in this last aisle for a very long time. The volumes on Murin dialect structures weren't publicly available outside Imperial academic circles. VTech had needed a special clearance level to access Murin linguistic files during mission preparation on the station 8 years ago. A 3-week review process. Documentation. 2 signatures from senior intelligence officers. Someone had placed this in a public library basement with new creases on the spine, because people were reading it. A library volunteer appeared. "Can I help you with anything?" "No," VTech said. "Thank you." The volunteer smiled and walked away. VTech looked at the shelf. The university was 4 blocks north. VTech had walked past it on the first day. On the second day, the window on the east side of the lecture building was open, and fragments of a lecture drifted to the sidewalk. The flanking model is not random. It is based on resources. They rotate because sustained formation maintenance is metabolically expensive for carrion physiology. VTech stopped. The flanking model was classified tactical data. Its metabolic basis was classified at an even higher level. Before the colonial mission, Cadret had personally signed the authorization for VTech's access to that file. 3 weeks of review, documentation in triplicate. This was an open window in a university building. VTech went in. The class was 3rd year, 50 students in a stepped row. The professor was a young woman named Dr. Kim. By the sound of it, she spoke of Ki like a human talks about a subject they have lived with for a long time, not as something alien or exotic, but as a system with an internal logic that could be understood if one put in the effort. VTech sat in the back and listened for 40 minutes. Dr. Kim detailed the key formation doctrine, the Murin naval logistics, with numbers almost exactly matching classified Imperial estimates, citing human academic journals that had obviously published this information openly. A brief comparative analysis of VESC defensive architecture and carrion infiltration methodology, it sent a chill down VTech's spine. At the end, she answered questions with patience and precision. On the way out, VTech looked at the sign on the door. Xeno 301. Alien Military Systems, 3rd year undergraduate course. 3rd year undergraduate. The week layered its picture into place. A museum with a scale model of a VESC frigate in the main lobby, accurate to the placement of secondary engines. The inscription underneath was formal and calm, reconstructed from publicly available sensor data and spectral analysis. Order 2087, that was 33 years ago. The model had been standing there for 33 years. And in 33 years, no one in the museum had thought to treat it as anything extraordinary. A grocery store with a small section called Xenobiological Applications. Products developed using principles derived from alien biochemistry. Wound-closing agents that worked faster than standard human medicine, water purification systems based on Undran filtration biology. The labels mentioned their alien sources just as food labels mention ingredients simply, informatively, as one labels something when it isn't a secret. A cafe with a television in the corner showing a news segment. It briefly and without drama mentioned something called the Galactic Interaction Framework, a bureaucratic structure the human government had been developing for 15 years to regulate first contact scenarios, trade negotiations, and interspecies legal disputes. 15 years of bureaucratic infrastructure for a first contact that hadn't even happened yet. VTech sat in that cafe for 2 hours with a cup of coffee and tried to figure out how to correctly conceive of what the city was showing. This wasn't a city preparing for war. This wasn't a city ignoring the galaxy. This was a city that was quietly and without visible urgency absorbing everything it could find about species it knew existed, creating institutional infrastructure for their interaction when the moment arrived, and at the same time living its daily life with complete calm. The hardest thing to name was that it didn't look like a project. It looked like a habit. Marcus found VTech in the university's main cafe on the 8th day. Vitek was holding a book on Dalarian cultural philosophy as a cover, a book a visiting academic might plausibly carry, when a young man with dark eyes and a seemingly unlimited supply of opinions sat down, uninvited, and pointed to the cover. "That's Burr's translation," he said. "The new one is better. Burr struggles with the idioms of the third epic poem." Vitek looked at him. "Marcus," he introduced himself, extending a hand. "Xenoarchaeology. 4th year. You're a visiting lecturer?" "Something like that," Vitek said. It was obviously enough to establish rapport, because Marcus ordered coffee and started talking. He spoke about his research with the particular enthusiasm of a person who has found exactly what they are meant to do in life. The Xenoarchaeology program had existed for 12 years, had 400 students, and an annual conference that attracted researchers from 31 countries. Marcus had attended the last 3. He was working on a comparative analysis of pre-contact cultural markers across 8 alien civilizations, looking for patterns in how a society changes in the decades leading up to contact with a more advanced species. "The markers are very consistent," Marcus said. "There is almost always an acceleration in documentation behavior, as if a species starts trying to record everything at once, everything they had been missing for centuries. And usually, there is a big change in how they handle internal conflicts. Things that remained unresolved for centuries begin to resolve." He turned his coffee cup in his hands as if putting things in order. "Why would they put things in order?" Vitek asked. "Because contact changes the context. Whatever dispute they had before about borders, resources, ideology, it shrinks when something larger appears outside. Internal problems start to look different, smaller, more solvable." He shrugged. "We did the same. We've been doing it for 40 years. He said this without weight, not as a confession, but as an obvious thing everyone already knew. "You believe there is something outside?" Vitek asked. Marcus looked at Vitek with slight surprise at the question. "Warp signatures have been constant for 40 years. Of course there is something outside," he smirked. "We just haven't been officially introduced yet." Vitek said nothing. Marcus refilled his coffee and talked about the Berlin conference until the light outside the cafe turned amber, then gray. The bar was small and warm, smelling of wood and something fried, and that peculiar human calm that Vitek had identified early in the week as the default state of this species among people they trusted. Dr. Voss was at the far end of the bar when they arrived. A small, gray-haired woman drinking something amber with deliberate, even speed, as if settling in for a long stay. She watched the room with an attentiveness that, from the outside, looked like watching nothing. Vitek felt it from the other end of the room. 22 years of fieldwork had developed a specific sensitivity to being watched by people who knew how not to look like they were watching. It registered in the body before the mind could name it a small, precise pressure between the shoulder blades. Marcus introduced her with warmth. Dr. Aravis, founder of the university's Xenolinguistics program. Retired 3 years ago, but she still comes to this bar on Thursdays. She shook Vitek's hand, a firm grip, a dry palm. She looked at Vitek's face 3 seconds longer than social etiquette required, with the expression of someone recognizing a thing they had seen before in a different context. "You aren't American," she said. "No," Vitek said. Voss looked away. "I traveled before I retired. You develop an eye for people who are far from home." She didn't specify which eye. She didn't say what she used it for. The 3 of them talked for an hour. Marcus carried most of the conversation. "Doctor?" Voss contributed rare suggestions with the precision of a person choosing a word the way a carpenter chooses tools correct on the first try, without excess. When she spoke of alien linguistics, she did so with a specificity Vitek couldn't match with any public academic record found in a week. She knew things that shouldn't have been public. She used them as if they were. When Marcus went to the bar for another round, Dr. Voss didn't turn her head. She looked at her glass. Her voice was the same pleasant, unhurried voice with which she had discussed the declension structure of the Cora-clicking language 15 minutes earlier. "Tell your people," she said, "not to worry. We aren't hiding anything dangerous." She took a small sip of her drink. "We're just not finished yet." She set the glass down. Marcus returned with 3 drinks and a story about how an elevator broke at the Berlin Conference Hotel last year and what that meant for a conference that had placed all the xenoarchaeology panels on the 4th floor. Dr. Voss smiled at the right moments. She didn't look at Vitek again. Vitek sat with both hands on the table and thought about what not finished yet meant coming from a woman who had spent 30 years building a program teaching people to speak alien languages. In a city where classified Imperial tactical data sat in a public library, in a species that had stopped its own wars the moment it found the Empire moving in the dark nearby. The thought was cold. The bar was warm. Marcus was still talking. VTech smiled when he smiled. They stayed until the bar closed. That night, in a small apartment above a laundromat and a cafe, VTech sat by the window, watching the city go quiet and thinking about what the week was trying to say. The mission objective said, "Find the weapons programs." The weapons programs weren't here, not in the way the objective assumed. There was no secret facility producing new ships. There was no research station in isolation developing tactical systems. There were no armed soldiers hiding behind the farmer's market, the library, the university, or the shelves with food applications. What was here didn't have a good name in the Imperial Intelligence Dictionary. A civilization that 40 years ago decided to become very good at understanding what it was about to meet. And then, clearing its throat, it had done so distributed across every university, library, research institute, and retired professor who still came to the same bar on Thursdays so thoroughly and so quietly that it didn't look like preparation. It looked like culture. VTech opened the communication device and began to compose a preliminary report. Stop. Reread page 71 of the original file. Recommend expanded analysis. Priority, low. VTech looked out the window at the darkening city, at the last people on the street below walking home under the ordinary lights of an ordinary evening on a planet that had spent 4 decades becoming something the Empire had no classification for. VTech closed the communication device. Not yet. More time, more city. Because Dr. Voss said, "Not finished yet." And the word "yet" did a lot of work in that sentence. VTech needed to understand what it carried before sending anything to Dret. The city was quiet. VTech sat by the window and did not sleep. On the 12th day, VTech followed a maintenance worker. It wasn't dramatic. The man was burly, carried a thermos, and at 6:15 a.m. went through an unmarked door in the basement of the university's main research building. VTech had watched unmarked doors for 12 days. This was the first door that felt different. It felt different because of what was outside it. City utility maps were available online. VTech had downloaded them 4 days ago. Energy consumption on this block, the university's research quarter, was 340% higher than what was required for the visible buildings. The surplus had no stated explanation in any public record. The ventilation exhaust from the basement system operated at a volume that didn't correspond to the claimed underground infrastructure. Something beneath that building was consuming significant power. VTech didn't go through the door. Going through a door without knowing what was on the other side is how operatives become cautionary examples for junior recruits. Instead, VTech stood on the corner of the building for 40 minutes in the early gray morning, watching the ventilation exhaust, calculating. The numbers weren't comforting. What the power implied in terms of active floor area and operating systems wasn't a research center. It wasn't a single facility. It was something the size of several city blocks beneath the university. And this was one site. Utility maps showed 11 others in the metropolitan area with similar unexplained needs, similar signatures, similar gaps between the claimed and the implied. 12 sites. One city. VTech thought about how many cities humanity had. VTech turned and returned to the apartment to write the report. The report was 6 pages long. VTech had been trained to be concise, and 6 pages from VTech meant content that couldn't be compressed further without losing something essential. The first 3 pages were standard observations, social mapping, civilian behavioral models, the library, and classified military information marked as requiring explanation. The university lecture with data on the key formation cross-referenced with the clearance level of that information. The 4th page, the conversation with Marcus, quoted without editing because the content was specific enough. The 5th page, Dr. Voss, her exact words, both phrases. The 6th page, energy consumption analysis and the 12 underground locations, and the calculation of what they implied. VTech sat by the window above the laundromat and looked at the street below, where a woman was walking a dog and a man was opening a flower shop, and thought about how the report would look to someone reading it cold, without the experience of 12 days in this city. It would look like proof of a weapons program. It wasn't proof of a weapons program. Weapons facilities had a signature VTech had learned to recognize over 22 years of field work. They had security perimeters, a specific pattern of vehicle movement, a background tension that lived in the people working near them, the low-level stress of a stored secret, the way a lie lives in the body of the person telling it. In this city, that tension wasn't there. Dr. Voss didn't have it, Marcus didn't have it, the Xeno students didn't have it. They had something else, something that took 12 days to correctly identify. They had patience, the deep, sustained patience of people who have been working on something for a long time and know they are close to the goal. The report was sent. What returned 12 hours later was not an intelligence response. It was a fleet deployment order. Supreme Commander Drett hadn't waited for the full report. The partial intelligence received before VTech sent the 6 pages, earlier intercepts, and initial observations from the arrived ship were enough for the faction of the Council that wanted military action from the start. Burr argued against it. Tess requested 30 more days of intelligence gathering. Imrat had insisted on action since the Dominion recording, and with the partial reports adding to the picture, he finally gathered enough support. 47 warships, 3 Tiron class, which was a political statement no less than a military one. 44 support vessels, landing transports, and logistics ships. They were moving. Drett read VTech's full report in his office above the fleet concentration area. He read it once quickly, sat for a moment, and then read page 6 again. 12 underground locations, 1 city, energy consumption, suggesting an area not matching the claimed infrastructure. He sent one message back. Did you identify what these facilities are producing? VTech's reply came 6 hours later. Too long for a simple answer. Not weapons. Something else. Give me more time. Drett looked at the deployment order on his secondary screen. There was no time. Director Sauron received word of the fleet movement 4 days before Imperial intelligence finished transmitting the deployment order to their own forward stations. She reflected on this information for 11 minutes, then called her team. The room was underground in a building in a city the Empire classified as a single human settlement, one of several thousand things the Empire misunderstood about humanity. 12 people, 3 screens. Very good coffee, which Sauron had long ago decided was not a luxury but a professional necessity. The fleet is moving. 47 ships, 19 days until human space. She looked at the room. Protocol Air, Sauron Authorization 77 Delta, full activation. Someone at the screens entered the sequence. Someone else exhaled. Demir looked up from his console. Archive Prometheus active. All nodes, full integration confirmed. Sauron nodded. Archive Prometheus wasn't named by anyone important. It was named by a physicist in 2032 who worked late on a cross-species database and, apparently, got a bit dramatic. The name stuck because the project grew too fast for anyone to have the administrative time to change it. It started as a documentation effort. In 2031, 8 years after the first confirmed detection of a warp signature, a working group was assembled. Calling it a human government was optimistic. 195 separate nations, most of which were still arguing about things they had argued about for centuries. The working group's mandate was simple. Assume contact will happen. Assume it will not be on humanity's terms. Prepare accordingly. Preparation consisted of several components. First, language. Every alien signal the Empire ever broadcast close enough for human instruments to detect was captured and analyzed. The xenolinguistics program, Doctor, Voss built in Portland, was one of 43 such programs in 26 countries. They spent 40 years comparing their findings, arguing over their conclusions, then comparing again. By 2061, human linguists had working models for 11 different alien languages. By 2074, the working model no longer covered what they had. The second component, biology. Every species whose biosignatures could be resolved from warp, radiation, and electromagnetic profiles was studied and modeled. Human medicine took a strange turn in the 2040s, driven by xenobiological research that had no obvious immediate application and which, over 30 years, yielded a series of advances described in medical journals as new approaches to physiology without specifying whose physiology was originally studied. The third component, tactics. This was the component Imperial observers never found because it wasn't on one site. It was distributed. It lived in universities and research institutes, in the heads of graduate students and retired professors, cross-referencing in a system that used humanity's almost inexhaustible tolerance for debate and disagreement as a feature. If 6 researchers from 6 countries who could barely agree on terminology independently arrived at the same tactical conclusion about the key formation doctrine, the conclusion was likely correct. If 4 agreed and 2 didn't, they kept arguing until they resolved it. The system was slow, loud, and complex to coordinate. It was also immune to being shut down because it wasn't a single thing that could be shut down. It was everywhere. Archive Prometheus is not a building, Soren told the room for the benefit of 2 new members who had joined over the last year. She said this every time. It is not a program in the organizational sense. It is 40 years of how this civilization directed itself toward a question and was very thorough in the answer. Demir pulled up a summary display on the main screen. The numbers were, as always, updated weekly, sometimes adjusted upon the completion of a new analysis. 11 alien languages with an active population of human speakers. Detailed physiological profiles of 9 alien species. Tactical analysis of 7 alien military doctrines, each stress-tested. Technological breakdowns of 6 alien engineering traditions, including 3 Imperial warship classes, the Tiron-class exhaust configuration, the Murin Naval Formation Library, the Vesk harmonic shield system, and the one that required the most creative searching, the rotation frequency of Tiron-class shields, obtained from a 4-second window of unshielded emission during a shield failure near a system the Empire thought was uninhabited. The system seemed uninhabited. It wasn't. Group leaders conducted briefings, Sauron said. All ground forces were on standby. Admiral Chen had possessed Protocol Air for a week and was conducting counter-scenarios. Sauron looked at the display. 19 days until the Imperial fleet arrives, she said. Let them get close. Let them see the civilian ships. Let them think they have the full picture. She walked to the coffee station. Then show them the picture has a reverse side. Vitek received notice of the fleet deployment and Dret's only follow-up question. Did you identify what these facilities are producing? Vitek looked at both pieces of information for a long time and sent a reply. Not weapons. Something else. Give me more time. Vitek sat by the window. The fleet was moving. Everything Vitek had almost understood beneath the basement of the university in Portland was now irrelevant, in that specific sense in which irrelevance comes when a large machine has already begun to move. The question of what the 12 underground locations contained would be answered in 19 days, and the answer would be given not in a report, but in what would happen when 47 Imperial warships met a species that had spent 4 decades building something Vitek still couldn't name. Vitek sent one more message to Dret, neither a report nor a status update. Whatever you think you will find, it is not what you will find. Then Vitek closed the communication device, because the fleet was already on its way, and Dret couldn't stop it, and there was nothing left to do but wait. 19 days. Outside, the flower shop opened. Its scent green and alive, something that didn't translate well into carrion drifted in from the street. Vitek thought of Dr. Voss in the bar, not looking, voice perfectly calm, saying not finished yet as if it were an insignificant weather observation. Thought of Marcus talking about how species put their internal conflicts in order before first contact, how the context changed, how internal problems looked smaller when something larger appeared outside. Humanity saw the Empire in the dark 43 years ago and stopped its internal war. For 43 years, they built Archive Prometheus. They built 12 underground sites under one city, more under others. By all means, they published classified Imperial tactical data in the public library. They taught 3 generations of students the key formation doctrine as a third-year requirement. And Dr. Voss, the woman who built the program that for 30 years taught human mouths to speak alien languages, looked at Vitek across the bar and said, "Not finished yet. Not we aren't ready. Not don't come and see what we built. Just not finished yet." The flower shop downstairs had a display with something yellow. Vitek didn't know what it was called. It was very bright against the gray morning. The Empire had observed humanity for 63 years. Humanity had observed the Empire for 40. And humanity, apparently, was still working. Vitek looked at the yellow flowers and thought about how a species that unified in 3 years, learned 11 alien languages in 40, and found a flaw in the exhaust of the Empire's best warship with 15 years of thermal imaging that this species could still be building something that hadn't yet reached a library basement, a bachelor's course, or a label in a grocery store. What was still underground, still unfinished. The morning was cold and ordinary. The city didn't look like what it was. 19 days. The Imperial fleet exited warp at the edge of human space on the 19th day, exactly on schedule. And Commander Vrex of the Eternal Victory opened a channel to the human communication network and issued a formal demand for surrender. It was standard procedure. Most species, faced with 47 Imperial warships in their home system, reacted with some variation of submission. The psychological weight of the fleet's physical presence had ended 3 wars before the first shot. Vrex had commanded such efforts 6 times. It worked because the math was obvious. 47 warships wasn't an argument. It was a statement of fact. The human response came in 17 seconds. It was in Vrex's language, not passing through the Imperial translation system. A human voice, speaking in a Carrion dialect, a regional dialect of the species that built the Eternal Victory. With a slight accent Vrex identified as Southern Coast, a regional deviation the Empire had documented but never expected. On the other side of the first contact channel, the voice said in clear, "Correct Tieron Carrion. We have received your message. Our answer is no. Please clarify your intentions before approaching." Vrex's communications officer looked at Vrex. Vrex looked at the fleet display. "Move to firing distance," Vrex said. Formation 7. Formation 7 was the Tieron-class flanking array, 3 Tieron-class ships in a wide arc. Support vessels filled the calculated gaps. The entire structure was designed to present more targeting solutions than most defensive systems could prioritize. The Empire had used Formation 7 741 times. It had worked 741 times. Vrex had used it twice personally. The fleet took position. The humans were silent. Then, from the civilian traffic corridors on the far side of the system, a series of signals appeared on the display. Small ships, fast scout configuration. The same category that had killed the Eternal Dominion. Vrex counted them quickly. 17 scout ships against 47 warships, 3 of them Tieron class. The math was not close. Vrex opened the targeting channel, locking the broadside guns on the fleet communication system filled with noise. Not random interference, but a specific pattern, harmonically calibrated. Vrex heard it for a fraction of a second before the filters engaged, recognizing its structure in that fraction of a second, realizing what it was targeting. It wasn't general jamming. It was designed around the Eternal Victory's targeting array, specifically for the frequency range, for the filtering algorithm. The signal was designed around the Eternal Victory's own system as a key to a specific lock. The filters cleared it in 9 seconds. 11 seconds. That was how long it took to clear the signal during the encounter with the Eternal Dominion. The Empire had spent 3 weeks analyzing that 1-1-second window and reduced it to 9 2-seconds less. The human scouts were moving during those 9 seconds. Formation 7 had an inner boundary, a radius within which the wide arc lost its geometric advantage because the fields of fire of the 3 warships began to overlap, creating blind spots for which the formation wasn't calculated at close range. Managing this was simple. Don't let enemy ships inside the inner boundary. The formation assumed no one would be fast or accurate enough to find the gaps in the outer line of defense. 17 human scouts were inside the inner boundary. Vrex's tactical officer was already calculating how the scouts had passed through the defense line. Preliminary results were not comforting. The scouts had slipped through the outer escort ships through a passage that required specific knowledge of the internal geometry of Formation 7. That geometry was in Imperial secret tactical files. Repositioned to Formation 12, Vrex said. Formation 12 was a Murin design the Empire had adopted 40 years ago. It wasn't in the same tactical database as Formation 7. Different classification level, different origin, different access requirements. It was the Empire's standard backup when Formation 7 was compromised. But the standard backup was an internal short-term measure, not a published doctrine. The human scouts adjusted before Formation 12 was complete. The tactical officer's voice was very careful. They moved before we completed the formation, sir. Before we finished the shift. That's impossible, Vrex said. They couldn't know what we would switch to when 7 was compromised. A pause. No, the tactical officer said. They couldn't. If only they didn't know our decision-making sequence, not just the formations, but the decision trees, the Carrion logic. How Imperial commanders reacted to specific tactical situations. Vrex looked at the display. 17 human scouts had redistributed. Each found a position in space where Formation 12 was assembling, not random positions. Each placed in optimal relation to the various components of the forming array. 17 ships, 17 Imperial weaknesses, 1 ship for each, as if they had been assigned targets before launch. All vessels, stop advance, hold position. The second skirmish happened 6 hours later after Vrex spent the interim time in communication with Dret. Dret listened to the analysis of Formation 7. He listened to the analysis of Formation 12. He said little. He asked one question. When you changed formations, how long did it take the human ships to react to the change? They moved before the shift was complete, sir. 11 seconds from my order to their movement. Changing from 7 to 12 physically takes 40 to 60 seconds. Yes, that's when they started reacting when they saw the 11 seconds of a 60-second maneuver. Vrex said nothing. They modeled your decision, Dret said. Flat, precise, as if reading something from a page. They knew that if 7 was compromised, you would switch to 12. They anticipated the shift before you executed it. They weren't reacting to what you did. They were reacting to what you were about to do. The connection went quiet for a moment. Supreme Commander, Rex said, the decision to switch from 7 to 12. In a compromised situation, it is an internal command protocol. It isn't published. It isn't in any document humans could get. No, Dret said, it isn't. This was, Vrex felt, the most terrifying interaction in the communication. The second skirmish made the form of the thing real. Vrex regrouped the fleet on the outer boundary, brought out the 3 Tiron-class warships. A direct approach formation, not a complex flanking array, not a pattern that required geometric knowledge to exploit. Just 3 of the Empire's most powerful warships moving toward the human ships in a straight line. Mass worked. Mass wasn't a formation that could be anticipated or bypassed. It was just an overwhelming physical presence moving in space. The human civilian ships retreated to the outer edge of the system. The scouts retreated to the planet. The 3 Tiron-class warships advanced. They were deep in the inner system before anyone noticed what the human planet's orbital defensive grid was doing. In the 3 minutes it took the fleet to cross the distance, it calibrated. The Tiron-class shield array rotated through a sequence of harmonic frequencies as standard operating mode. A rotating frequency was harder to neutralize than a fixed one. Breaking it required pinning an impulse to the window between rotations, and the speed and sequence of rotation were classified at the highest level. The orbital defense grid pulsed in a sequence that hit every window, not most of them enough to be a successful guess. Every rotating window was precisely calculated for all 3 Tiron-class warships. Simultaneously, 3 ships, 3 separate shield systems, each working independently, each hitting the window between its own rotations with an impulse calibrated for its specific frequency sequence. The tactical officer's voice sounded careful again. They have rotation specifications, sir. They have full rotation specifications for the Tiron-class shield array. I see it, Rex said. Those are Category 1 secret files. That isn't something that can be deduced from external observation. I don't know, Rex said. The 3 warships received hits on their secondary systems. Non-lethal, non-paralyzing, demonstration-level damage precise and controlled, which reported what could have been done without doing it. Then the ship's medic sent a report. On the 3rd Tiron-class ship, the Relentless, there was a carrion crew, 14 members, standard for joint interspecies operations. The Relentless was struck by an impulse the systems classified as negligible, a glancing impact on the right secondary array. Acceptable damage. The medic's report said the opposite. The carrion crew. All 14 lost consciousness simultaneously. All 14. The medic's note was precise and puzzled. The impulse apparently included a subsonic frequency component calibrated to carrion auditory physiology. The carrion crew members are unharmed but completely immobilized. All 14 simultaneously. The impulse apparently was designed not to damage the ship's systems, but specifically to strike the carrion crew members, leaving non-carrion crew members unharmed. Surgically precise, as if they had a crew roster. Vrex read it. Read it again. The impulse was designed specifically for the carrion crew, not as a side effect, but as the primary goal. Get me the Supreme Commander, Vrex said. All ships, immediately send crew composition by species to my terminal. Reports came in within 3 minutes. 47 ships, 11 species, distributed across the fleet according to patterns formed over years of joint operations. Carrions in scout ships, Murins in the ship line, Vesks in engineering corps, Senior Dolari in the command structure. Vrex looked at the breakdown of the composition and thought about what a species could do with detailed physiological profiles of every species in the fleet. Of this information, thought of 17 other species-specific weapons, calibrated and ready. Get me Supreme Commander Dret, Vrex said. The communication officer hesitated. Sir, we are receiving a transmission from the planet's surface. Vrex turned. The voice on the channel was human, speaking carrion with that slight coastal accent. very calm, the particular calm of a person who has waited a long time to say something. "Commander Vrex, we want to be clear. We are not going to destroy your fleet. Over the next 24 hours, we will demonstrate that we know the capabilities of every one of your ships, the physiological requirements of every one of your species, and the tactical logic of every one of your command protocols. We will demonstrate this without killing anyone." A pause. "We recommend you study the attached file before making further tactical decisions." The file was 700 pages long. Vrex opened it. The first section was a complete breakdown of Imperial military doctrine, standard formations, backup sequences, emergency action protocols that existed only in sealed command documents. The second section was secret technical specifications for 6 classes of Imperial warships, annotated with the methods of human research used to obtain each piece of data, none of which involved violating Imperial security. All observation, all analysis, all obtained by watching passing ships, listening to broadcast signals, studying the shape of things outside for a very long time. The third section was species-specific biological and physiological vulnerability profiles. There were 11, one for each species in the fleet. Sources, according to the document's footnotes, taken from human academic journals published openly over the last 30 years. Vrex sat. This was something Vrex very rarely did during a skirmish. The 24 hours that followed were, as promised, bloodless. They were also the most precise and comprehensive demonstration of tactical knowledge Vrex had seen in 20 years of fleet command. Maneuvers were anticipated before their completion. Communication frequencies were identified and selectively disrupted, not suppressed, but selected. Specific frequencies were targeted while others remained open, so the fleet could continue to function, but nothing confidential could be transmitted without their knowing it already. Coordination signals between ships were routed through human systems, returned with slight modifications that served no military purpose other than the demonstration that they could be modified. On the 19th hour, the human tactical team sent a note. It was addressed to the commander of the Relentless, specifically. It stated that the 14 carrion crew members experienced no adverse effects from the immobilization impulse and would fully recover within 6 hours. It included a brief summary of the physiological mechanism and a note from the human doctor expressing professional regret for the discomfort and wishing the Carrion crew members a speedy recovery. The note was signed by Dr. Yara Chen, Director of Diplomatic Integration. Vrex read it twice, then opened a channel to Supreme Commander Dret. "Demonstration complete," Vrex said. "They are ready to negotiate." Dret, on the other end, was silent for a moment. "What do they want?" Vrex looked at the 700-page file on the secondary screen, looked at the dark space around the fleet. Quiet and unchanged human planet, sitting in it as if it had always been there, which it had. "They want a table," Vrex said. "That's all. They want to sit at a table." Another pause. "Did we ever have a choice?" Dret asked. Vrex thought about Formation 7, about the 9-second noise signal calibrated to the Eternal Victory's targeting array, about the 14 carrion crew members who lost consciousness and the doctor's note expressing professional regret. "No," Vrex said. "I don't think there was." The armistice was signed on the 43rd day. They were 43 unpleasant days. Vrex's fleet sat on the outer boundary of the system, read the 700-page file, and transmitted it in full to Dret, who transmitted it to the High Council, which spent 6 days arguing whether the document was authentic, and another 4 days arguing what to do given that it was. The 4-hour demonstration was, as promised, bloodless. Within 1 human day, the fleet watched its formations be anticipated before completion. Its communication frequencies were identified and selectively disrupted. Its coordination signals were routed through human systems and returned with slight modifications that served no military purpose other than the demonstration that they could be made. On the 21st hour, the human tactical team transmitted a correction to an Imperial navigational calculation that one of Vrex's junior officers had made, using the Relentless's own computational notation, a notation that had not been published outside the Imperial Marine Corps, with a note offering a more efficient approach. They corrected the math using the notation. They shouldn't have known. The note was polite. By the 24th hour, the council stopped arguing about whether to negotiate and started arguing about whom to send. This argument lasted another 19 days, which was long even by council standards. On the 43rd day, the armistice was signed, and a delegation arrived in orbit to be delivered to the planet. Dr. Yara Chen waited for them below. She arrived at the spire of Vrita on a human vessel that the Empire's docking team studied for 20 minutes before permitting landing. The vessel wasn't particularly advanced by Imperial standards. That was expected now. Humans hadn't built their advantage in armor or engine power. They had built it somewhere else entirely. And the unremarkable ship standing at the spire's dock was a reminder that one should worry not about the ship, but about the people inside who had spent 40 years deciding what to know. Dr. Chen disembarked with 2 assistants and a small travel bag. She looked at the spire with the expression of a person who had been shown photographs of a place enough times for it to seem familiar before seeing it in person. Not awe, but recognition. She was 34 years old and looked younger. She was the daughter of Admiral Chen, who had commanded the fleet during the 2 4-hour demonstration, and she was the director of diplomatic integration of Archive Prometheus, a position the Archive had created 8 years ago on the grounds that contact was inevitable, and someone had to be formally ready for the conversation. She spoke in the Tiron-Carian dialect with a slight coastal accent. She also greeted Councillor Burr in Dolari. In the first language of the Dolari, the old formal register in which Burr's generation grew up, before the standard Imperial dialect became dominant. Burr froze for a moment, like a person addressed in the language of his childhood from an unexpected source. He pulled himself together, took his place. Dr. Chen sat in the center of the table, not on the edge, at the visitor's place. In the center. Dret looked at this choice for a moment and said nothing. "You will explain Archive Prometheus," he said. "Yes," she said. "I will." She didn't use notes. "In 2031, she began, we confirmed the presence of a warp signature in nearby space of non-human origin. We had debated the probability of other life for centuries, so the confirmation was not a surprise. The surprise was how close you were, how long the Empire had passed through our sensor range without stopping. She looked at Dret without lowering her gaze. "You were not yet a priority contact," Dret said. "Yes," she said. "We understood that this was actually useful. It gave us time." She explained the archive like a human explains a place they have lived their entire professional life in, not like a presentation prepared for an audience, but as a description of what they knew very well. The first 40 years of the language program. 11 active alien languages with a population of human speakers distributed across academic communities on every continent, cross-referenced by researchers who had never met each other and had arrived at the same conclusions independently. This was the methodology, she explained. If a finding survived the disagreement of 6 independent research groups who could barely agree on terminology, then the finding was likely correct. The biological program. Second, xenobiological research, which yielded, among other things, the immobilization impulse, the formation-breaking tools, 17 different species-specific interventions that the 2 4-hour demonstration hadn't used, but which existed and were ready, and which she noted without elaboration were catalogued. Tactical programs. Third, 30 years of analysis published in journals, built in a distributed system in thousands of institutions, not located in one place, not managed by one organization, located everywhere, managed by everyone who contributed, which, here she paused, seemed to make a quick mental calculation totaled in the range of 400 people over the last 4 decades, working in parts, cross-referencing, not always knowing what they were cross-referencing. The council was silent throughout the presentation. Councillor Tez of the Vesks spoke once. The Tiron-class exhaust configuration. You deduced this with spectral analysis? Yes, Dr. Chen agreed. A combination of spectral analysis and thermal imaging. 15 years of data from passing Tiron-class ships. The gap is geometrically predictable from the cooling system design. Once you have enough thermal data to model the interior, we had enough by 2072. The shield array rotation frequency. That cannot be deduced from external observation. No, Dr. Chen agreed. We obtained that from the Sol incident. The room changed. Tez was very quiet. The Sol incident was sealed at the highest classification level. Yes, Dr. Chen added nothing to that. She waited. The Sol incident was, as far as the Council knew, an internal Imperial affair from 19 years ago. A Tiron-class warship experienced a partial failure of the shield array near a system which a subsequent review confirmed was uninhabited. The failure was resolved in the field. The incident was in sealed files. The system seemed uninhabited. It wasn't. Imrat of the Murins, who hadn't spoken since the beginning of the meeting, slowly said, "You had people there. We had instruments. Dr. Chen said. Passive collection arrays with low electromagnetic emission placed in uninhabited systems near Imperial trade and patrol routes for 20 years. The shield failure on the ship in that case gave us a 4-second window of unshielded emission data. She folded her hands on the table. 4 seconds was enough. The silence that followed was the kind that happens after a revelation changing the shape of the problem retroactively. Not just the current problem, but all past ones. The entire 6-3-year history of Imperial observation of humanity read in the light of the fact that humanity had also carefully, patiently observed with instruments in uninhabited systems along the Empire's own routes for at least 20 of those years. Dret said, "Why didn't you act sooner? You had tactical information. The Dominion was a demonstration. You could have attacked the fleet before it deployed." Dr. Chen looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Why wait?" She paused for a moment, choosing her words. "Because we weren't finished yet," she said. The word hung in the chamber. Old Burr looked up from his hands. Dret heard it just as he had heard it in Vitek's report. Page 5. The old woman in the bar. Not finished yet. The same phrase, said with the same quality, not a warning, not bragging, a simple statement of the current state of affairs. "What does that mean?" Dret said. "It means Archive Prometheus is 40 years of work," Dr. Chen said. "It means we know a great deal about the Empire and its members, the species, its military and political structure. It means what I described to you today is accurate and complete." She paused. "It also means we have been working on a second question in parallel with the first." "What is the second question?" "The first question was, what is out there, and what do we need to know about it? Archive Prometheus is the answer to the first question. We built it because we needed to be safe, because we needed to ensure that what came from the dark came to the table, not to conquest." She looked at the council. "The second question is different. We started asking it about 11 years ago." Dret waited. She smiled. It was a sincere smile. The smile of a person who finds their subject genuinely, deeply remarkable. "What else is out there," she said, "that we haven't found yet?" The peace treaty consisted of 6 pages. Mutual recognition, defined borders, a trade structure. The beginning of what the human project submitted for consideration before the Imperial team had finished its version called the General Galactic Framework, which was the bureaucratic infrastructure humanity had been building for 15 years, just for this occasion. Dret signed it, Dr. Chen signed it, 2 assistants witnessed it. She left that same day on an unremarkable ship with the same small bag she had arrived with. Counselor Tess found Counselor Burr in the hallway outside the chamber. He stood by a window overlooking the city beneath the spire. He wasn't moving. "The second question," Tess said. "What else is out there?" "We have been mapping the galaxy for 400 years, Burr said. "We have a detailed picture," Tess said. Burr paused for a moment. His scales, old and pale, caught the light from the window. "We had a detailed picture of humanity," he said. "We had 63 years of observation. We called them Class 3 primitive." He paused. "We weren't looking closely enough." He paused. "How many more Class 3 classifications are in the survey database?" Tess didn't answer. She knew the number. "They aren't studying us anymore," Burr said. "We signed the treaty. They are safe. What launched the archive, the threat, the fire beneath them that is resolved. Now they turn to the question that, apparently, always interested them more." "We don't know what they found," Tess said. "No," Burr agreed. "We don't know." He looked at the city below. That woman spoke Dalari, the first register of the language, the old form. The program that spawned her has been running for 40 years. The people who trained spent their careers preparing for us." He turned away from the window. "What does the next generation do? Those who grow up after the treaty, after we are no longer what started it all?" Tess had no answer. Burr walked down the hallway. "They looked at the galaxy," he said, more to himself than to her, "and found us. And we are, apparently, not the most interesting thing they found." "Interesting," he said, reaching the end of the corridor. Deep beneath a mountain in a country called Norway, in a complex that wasn't in the public documentation of Archive Prometheus, a team of 9 people worked in a room with very good coffee and screens displaying signals from a region of the galaxy the Empire had surveyed in 2089 and classified as empty. The survey wasn't entirely wrong. In that region, there were no habitable planets, no warp signatures, no electromagnetic transmissions of the type that indicate an active civilization. Imperial survey instruments found nothing, and Imperial survey instruments were good. The signals started 11 years ago. They weren't Imperial, They weren't human. They weren't anything from the Archive Prometheus catalog, which by this point was a catalog of 11 species with detailed documentation. Whatever was producing these signals, it wasn't in the catalog. Whatever was producing these signals, it wasn't based on the development models of Archive's young species civilizations. The patterns were too structured. The information density was too high. The signals were old. Older than the Empire. Older than the Empire's survey history, so old that the team's chronologists had spent 2 years arguing about it and, finally, recently agreed. The signals were approximately 40 years old, which meant that what was producing them had been producing them when humanity was still developing agriculture, when the Empire's oldest species were still in their first technological phase, when in the galaxy, as far as was known then, there was nothing capable of intentional interstellar communication. Something had been communicating in the galaxy for 40 years. And 11 years ago, close enough to human space to detect this communication, something appeared. A new change in the pattern. A structural element the team hadn't seen in earlier signals. A repetition deep in the data, patient and precise, like a question asked again and again. Who? Something that rushed, like something that had been sending a signal for 40 years and, 11 years ago, changed that signal, directed it, refined it, changed its character in a way that was small but unmistakable to anyone who was paying enough attention. The team leader was a woman named Dr. Myra Asai. She had been in this room for 9 of the 11 years. She hadn't attended the peace treaty meeting. She wasn't invited to the peace treaty meeting because Director Sauron correctly decided that the peace treaty meeting wasn't the best time to present the second question. The second question required more time, more work, more of the patient, distributed, cross-referencing method that had cracked 11 languages over 40 years. This language required more time, but they were making progress. Dr. Asai looked at the latest analysis on her screen. In the new part of the signal was a structure they hadn't seen before, a sub-pattern within the repetition, smaller, more complex. She had been looking at it for 3 days. Her best linguist, a young man named Quain, who had joined the team 2 years ago and possessed that particular quality of attention that made Dr. Asai glad she had hired him, had been looking at it for 3 days, too. He was currently sleeping on a small couch in the corner of the room. He hadn't slept in 31 hours. She looked at the sub-pattern. It had structure. She had pondered it for 3 days, not wanting to speak until she was more confident. It had the structure of what? Something that wasn't just broadcasting. Something that was asking. Not randomly, not in all directions. The signal had broadcast in all directions for 40 years. The change 11 years ago was a narrowing, a focusing. The adjusted signal was directed toward a specific region of space. A region of space containing Earth. Imperial survey instruments had found nothing in that remote region and classified it as empty. And Imperial survey instruments were good, and the region was, by any standard used by the Empire, empty. But something in that empty region had been watching the galaxy for 40 years. And 11 years ago, it noticed something in the region of a small, blue, previously unremarkable planet, and asked a question into the dark, patiently, like something that has all the time it needs, waiting for a species cautious enough, thorough enough, and curious enough to eventually hear it. Dr. Asai reached for her coffee. "Quain," she said softly. He woke instantly. The way people wake up who have been sleeping over a problem, they were resting from it. He walked to the screen, looked at what she was pointing to. He was silent for a long time. "It's asking something," he said. "I think so," she said. "Let's answer." She looked at the signal at 40 years of patience, at the one-year adjustment directed here in anticipation. She thought of Archive Prometheus, of 40 years when her civilization had directed itself toward a question and was very thorough about what that thoroughness had built and what it had preserved, and how it had led them to the table, not to conquest. Of what Dr. Chen had told the Imperial Council. "What else is out there? What haven't we found yet?" "Not yet," Dr. Asai said. She looked at the screen. "We're not finished yet." The signal played in the room beneath the mountain, patient and old and waiting, and humanity as usual, thorough, with all the time it needed, continued to ask questions.